Alright, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to start taking these bolts where the differential bolts to the axle housing on the swing arm. We're going to take these bolts out. There's 4 of them all the way around. There's big flange here. I'm going to see if I can leave this skid guard on the bottom of this differential. I'm also going to leave this tube on. I just put fresh bearings in. This might be a good time for you if you haven't put new bearings in, or if you don't have newish bearings. You still want to check them and look at them, but if this tube looks okay and you know these bearings are good, I'm just going to leave it bolted on. There's also 4, they look like maybe 10mm bolts here, and I'm going to pull those off too. Alright, I've got the 4 bolts out here, as you can kind of see. Sorry, there's not very much light here. Over here, these are 12mm bolts. I thought they were 10 earlier, but these are 12, and it looks like, just for ease of use, I'm going to have to take the skid plate off. It's no big deal. These are still 12mm. There's probably 3 or 4. I'm going to go ahead and take those off. Okay, I've got the skid plate off, as you can see. The bottom of it shows that the paint's a little thin, so I'll probably paint this before I put it on. Yes, I spray paint all my own parts. How else are you going to have it done? You could have them powder coated, but that would cost an awful lot of money, wouldn't it? Well, I'm going to get these last 2 bolts out, and that should drop the differential for me along with this tube. And then the last thing to do, of course, my shock is still hanging on over there with a loose bolt. Then the next thing will be to remove these caps and give it a shot taking those nuts out. Almost got it. It's kind of neat holding the differential with my knee and holding the phone. Got the bolt out. Alright, let's see here. Now the drive shaft is let go. I'm going to pull that vent off. Okay, as you can see, differential's off. Drive shaft's kind of hanging out there. Hard to see, you need a little more light. Alright, so in any event, next step, small screwdriver to remove. So we just got our differential off. Everything's just kind of hanging here. Over here you'll see the drive shaft boot, and what you'll discover if you look at yours is that it's quite possible that it could be damaged or torn. It's not uncommon for them to get tiny little pinholes. I could not find a good replacement one. People were selling $30 ones on eBay that were just in terrible shape. One guy even sent it to me after I asked him in an email, does this have any holes in it? He was like, no, it's absolutely perfect, and he sent it to me. He ended up giving me my money back, and I had to ship it back to him, which was a waste of my time. So in any event, I tried a couple things, and at the time I had a Foreman 500, and I grabbed a couple. I had a couple of these boots laying around from this project, and I tried this. It's an 05 Foreman 500 boot, and it works perfectly. It's not bent quite the same way, but it's long enough, and the ends are the right size. So now that we've got this off of here, we are going to take the cap off of here, and we're going to try. Well, it's full of grease from where I just packed it full of grease. Got some of this grease out of here. You can see my tool. I'm going to stick that in there. Well, there we go. Alright, that's in there. And you'll find that it's kind of difficult to find a wrench that is large enough to fit this thing. So yes, I had to get an adjustable wrench. You'll see if you buy one of these tools and you start riding around town going to parts houses and stuff like that, you'll find out pretty quick that they don't have anything that's the right size. This is like a 1.5. Alright, I had to pop it a couple times with a hammer, the end of the wrench that is, and I believe that we have successfully, that's interesting. I've never been in there, so this is interesting. There's actually some grease here. Oh, my grease I put on there is really good for acting like a suction. We'll look down in there real quick and just kind of looks like everything's in order. Alright, and we've got our plug here. So now we're going to go to the other side that uses our castellated side. Alright, so now we're on our other side here. And you can see how the castellated piece fits in here. Now we've got to get this loose. I've moved my brake cables out of the way, and I will probably end up having to move something else here in a minute, I bet. Let's see if I can. So this pesky thing is a real pain, but like I said, we're going to learn how this works. First you got to put this thing in here. It is definitely counterclockwise. Instead of using this big wrench, this big monster like I did on the other side, instead this time I used a short 17mm socket and 3/8 drive, and you can see the 17 goes right on here, nice and tight, no play. I actually put a breaker bar on this. I took a chance, put a breaker bar on it, and once I got it locked in there I had to really lean on the bike. But you can see the lock ring and the bolt itself, the pivot bolt, has come out. Now this is interesting. I'd really like to see this lock ring move so that I can tighten this in. So this is an interesting little dilemma here that I'm going to have to figure out what's going on. So what we're doing right now is we're going to go ahead and take this shock off. Okay, and what we're going to do is I'm going to grab my tool real quick and we are going to take this pivot bolt out. Now, what we've got is the drive shaft kind of hanging on there and the vent tube hanging on, but it is is out, and the swing arm is removed. Okay, so what we're about to do now, I've got the old swing arm off completely. You can see there is nothing under there. A couple of things we're going to do is we're going to start some waterproofing. We're going to put our bearings in. In my case, I won't need this new race. I'm going to use the race that's in my new old stock swing arm. I'm basically going to fill this up with grease, fill that whole cup up with grease, and I'm going to place this in here. Then our little black seal goes in flat side out to close this in. Okay. Then we're also going to take our drive shaft. I've cleaned a lot of the muck off of it from the last time when I had it apart, when I put that TRX 500 boot on. I'm going to put a little grease in here that'll help this stay in place when I reinstall it. Another thing I'm going to do is just put a little grease in here. You know, this stuff doesn't see the light of day very often, so you really want to try and take advantage of it and get some grease on it while you can. I like grease. There's a lot of nuts and bolts, so when I reinstall them, I put grease on the threads just to make sure they don't get corroded, so that the next time I want to take them apart, I'll know they won't be frozen. Luckily, on this adventure so far, we haven't had to use the heat gun. We just want to make sure that that's good and lubricated, and then down in here where we squeeze the grease, we want to get those teeth all greased up. Okay, and then we'll... Okay, so now that we've got our bearings in with our seals, we've pumped those full of grease with our grease gun. We are installing the differential now, and as soon as we get these bolts in here, we will hang the whole thing back up where it goes in the back of the bike, and reconnect everything. Okay, we've rehung the swing arm. I dropped the drive shaft in first. I pushed it up in there. I reconnected the shock just to hang. You know, I left the nut loose. I tightened in this side first, then I tightened in that side. Now we're about to reconnect our hubs and put our axle back in. What we're going to do right now is address something that's really important. You may have noticed in the first video that I left this tube on when I replaced the swing arm. Some of you might say, well, why did you do that? Because it would have been much easier to go ahead and take it off then. Not really. You know, it's a built-in handle, and I like being able to grab the differential by this tube instead of trying to keep both hands on it. So we have to take this off, and the reason we do is because there is a spacer on the axle that you have to position between there's a spacer you have to position between the outer bearings here in the tube, and you have to get this off in order so that when you put the axle back in, you are able to get it in there. You see, I use a lot of grease. I even have a grease zerk on here. Not sure I'm going to reinstall those because I had so much grease in there that I noticed that some was getting past the seal in the differential. And while I wouldn't normally mind that, I'm just not sure what the grease is going to do to the fluid in there. So I drained it a couple times after I pumped it full of grease. In any event, it seems to be doing a good job. All the grease is keeping the mud and dirt out. The grease looks nice and clean if you can kind of see the color of it. I did that almost a year ago. Alright, now that we've got that other tube off, we're going to slide this axle back in here. You'll notice the spacer is not on here, but look at this end. My spacer is on this end. Okay? These are what keep pressure and keep the axle position centered. We're going to be careful because we don't want to mess up any splines. We're going to gently wiggle it back and forth until we get it in there. And you see the spacer keeps it right about where it needs to be. Now we're not worried about perfect positioning now because once we put everything together, it's gonna pull it where it needs to be. Okay, I've got the bolts in, and I always put grease on the threads for these bolts, just a little. And a lot of the main reason I do it is because you're threading a really old bolt into an aluminum casing, and you certainly want to make sure that they're nice and tight. I tighten them, you know, in a pattern, crisscross, like I'm tightening a wheel onto a hub. And I'm very firm, but I don't apply too much pressure. What does most of the holding of this axle is the differential. So you're not trying to torque these on so you spin them out and break them off. You just want to get them in there nice and tight, keep going around in a circle until you have them all good and just a little past, you know, what you would think is tight enough to thread those bolts into an aluminum thread. So now the next important thing is, during this process, if you're replacing your bearings, something to keep in mind is one side of the bearings is larger than the other, so make sure that when you open that package of bearings up, you really pay attention. Don't drive the wrong size bearing into the wrong holder. I can't remember which one's bigger. It's either this one or that one, but you'll know if you hold them up there. But check them out and be real careful first. No one tells you these things. You have to find them out the hard way. These seals are instantly bad if you don't grease them before you actually bolt everything together. So make sure you always grease your seals up. I'm going to go ahead and grab my grease gun. And even though you may think, gosh, he's already got tons of grease, to me, for a vehicle that's going to be constantly covered in gook and mud, I want to make sure all these things are sealed up. And so I'm going to put grease on them as much as I possibly can. You probably want to put your fingers in there and mush it all around and make sure it's spread out nice and even. But I've already done that. These aren't new. This already has plenty of grease on it. Like I said, you can never have too much lubricant if you're me. So next is the other side. I pulled the spacer back away, and I am going to once again overkill this grease, because this is a brand new swing arm. Marine grade grease, that's what you want. We'll push this back. Make sure you've got it seated on the other side just to help yourself out. Okay, now we're on the other side here. Something that's kind of important, there is an O-ring here, and you don't have to kill yourself looking for it, because usually grease makes it stick to whatever you stick it on. But you know, you might want to check it out, because again, there's the water and mud factor, and we don't want to have that cause a problem for us. So this goes right here in this little relief, and we're going to leave that there for the moment. And guess what time it is?
Grease time.
That's right, lovely assistant. And then out here as well, we want to make sure, you know, that we seal around the outside of this. A little bit of grease falls out, no big deal. We just go ahead and wipe it off, no big deal. A little bit of grease on the studs here just to help our really old 17mm nuts go back on. Why am I greasing this? Because there is no gasket, and the grease is going to act like a gasket. It's It's going to give us a nice sticky, smooth point to mount against that swing arm. Okay, now that we've got our axle through, we're going to put our other spacer on this end here. Now, this spacer goes on here like this, not like this. You would almost want to think that the angled side goes out, but it doesn't. Flat side out, like this. Okay, make sure it's seated all the way on there. Now when you put this back on, you're going to want to make sure you grease it up really good. Put this on here just like this. That spacer keeps pressure against the bearings. And you're going to want to make sure that you grease these bolts just a little bit, because you're actually screwing really old bolts into an aluminum casing, and you want to make sure that you're not stripping anything out. The grease also acts as a barrier to keep dirt and water and things like that out. So it's not a question of will I ever have to take this apart again. It's a question of when will I have to take this apart again. These things require maintenance, and you're going to have to take it apart at some point. So a little tiny bit of grease on your threads will make life lots easier when the time comes. Okay, so now we've squeezed a bunch of grease in there, and I've got my hub. And the reason why I'm going to put this hub on this end first, before I even assemble the other side, it's going to kind of help to hold the axle and the spacers still. Okay, so you can see I've greased this up thoroughly. Love some grease, right? We're going to put this on here. I've even got my washer in there already. And you could do it the other way if you want to. You can assemble the other side first. I like to do it this way. Of course, I'm not going to put the final tightening on it. I'm just going to get it snugged in, just to hold my axle still and kind of suck the axle over to this side as far as I can. Remember, anything you take apart, if it's greasy or thick with mud and it's just nasty and corroded, you want to use a wire wheel on it. Get it nice and clean. It's essential that you put these hubs together clean and greased, as with everything that you take apart on your bike, especially where the rear end is. Make sure it's clean first, make sure it's tight, make sure that you think about safety. So now we're back over here again. We've got all this greased up from before. Studs are all greased up. We've got our gasket in place. We've got our spacer on here facing the right direction. We're going to put this on here like this. Okay. I'm checking the space to make sure that this looks like it's going to seat properly, and it looks like it will. So we're going to go ahead and put this on here. You're going to notice that as you tighten this down, it's not going to be a perfect fit. You're going to have to tighten it in a diagonal pattern, like as if you were tightening lug nuts on a wheel. And you're going to have to slowly go around and get each one. And the reason why is it's a compression fit, so you know it fits tight. So now that that's on there, again, you're not trying to break everything off. You want it to just be good and tight. Let's look at these brakes for a minute. These brakes have recently been replaced. This seal is not in the best shape, so what do we do, lovely assistant, with seals and things like that?
We grease them.
Exactly. See, even she knows. And so what we want to do is, once again, coat it, because this is our seal against water and mud and sand. This isn't a race bike. It's a having fun, cruising around in the woods kind of a bike. And for that reason, we've got to make sure that we maintain it and the bearing surfaces by sealing as much of it as we can.
Grease again.
Alright, so we've got this open space here where our hub is going to go in. And we're going to fill that in with grease. I guess if you're going to follow my lead on this, better buy yourself a couple tubes of grease. Yeah, probably not a couple. Now, how do you know which hub goes on which side? Well, the bearings once again are different sizes. This side I believe is a little bit larger than that side, but when you get them in the package, you'll notice only after you hold them together. There's two on each side that share the load. You're going to want to make sure that you put, the pairs of bearings together. So anyway, this goes on this end, and we know this because it's got the threaded holes for the brake drum. So now what we're doing is we're just putting this back on. I put my great big washers back in here to take up a little more space. You want it to be tight for safety's sake. You want it to be tight to maintain the way that the axle splines lock together. Failing to not make them tight enough causes things to get all messed up and break. What I'm going to do is use a very expensive tool here known as a 2x4, and I'm just going to snug this up just to make sure that it's tight so that I can do my final assembly here. We're getting really close to being done. I'm about to put this drum back on. You see we've got this greased up, we've got that full, we got this greased up, we've got the hub on. I'm about to put the brake drum back on and put the screws back in. Okay, so here we have our brakes, our brake lines, cables, and you'll notice that there are two different sizes. This keeps you from messing stuff up and putting the wrong one in the wrong hole. Okay, the big one's on the bottom. I'm going to pull the rubber back and let it slide down in there. Same thing with this one. There we go. Now they're in. And what we have to do now is get our adjustment nuts and our springs. And we're going to put these back on. And this is going to be important to go ahead and do now so that we can get our breaker bar and our ratchet on this nut here and get it good and tight. Alright, so what I've done is I've got these back on here. The trick to adjusting this for me, because I've adjusted 3 or 4 of these on 3-wheelers and countless others on 4-wheelers and some bikes too. These adjusters are basically supposed to just be snug enough to hold the arm in place. The arm is spring loaded, it's got a return spring on the back side of it. So you want the back one to be just enough, and you want to be able to push it forward and see some space in between them. You get it too tight, of course, the brake's going to be engaged all the time. For right now, for our purposes, we do want the brake to be almost engaged. So I'm going to tighten this down quite a bit, actually. And then what I'm going to do is I am going to set my emergency brake. Now, if you're missing your handle, on your left side handlebar, and you just can't set your emergency brake, or your brakes aren't good enough and you're just trying to put this thing back together, then you can always put the wheels back on, hold them down, have some friends sit on the wheels for you while you tighten this middle nut here. While you tighten this middle nut right here with the wheels on. And I may still have to do that, but I think my emergency brake is going to hold that for me well enough. Okay, so we've set our emergency brake. We're putting this on here. And we have a very expensive piece of technology here. It's going to enable us to tighten this bolt a couple times. Alright, that should be good enough. Now I'm going to do the other side, so you'll have to imagine what that's like, because we're not going to video that part. It's the same procedure. So what I'm doing this for is to show you the right way that a cotter pin should look in case you didn't have one and you're putting one in for the first time. Maybe you've never messed with one. You may have to do some adjusting on your nut just a tiny bit to get the holes to line up. Some of the newer ones have multiple holes all over the place. This one only has like 4. So you may have to adjust forward or backwards. We try not to adjust backwards on the nut. We try to just tighten. Over tightening can have a bad effect just as well as too loose. So this really needs to be pretty tight. When you pull this through, the first thing you're going to do, you're going to see how the angle that the cotter pin is sitting. You pull it up and you fold it over, and then you grab this with some needle nose and you fold it over the back. That's how a cotter pin goes on. All right, as you can see, I have put my wheel spacer on, and I like to talk to everybody like they've never done this before. So forgive me, but in case you don't know, the part number in my first video that I gave you for these wheels, the back spacing on these wheels is too great to try and mount them without these wheel spacers. Okay, so you can't just go order the wheels and then decide I'm gonna put them on. You're gonna need spacers in order to do that. So make sure that if you order those wheels, or any aftermarket wheels for that matter, you're gonna have to have some spacers, more than likely, on the back of this bike. The wheels will rub on the side of this muffler. You may actually get away with it on the other side, but on the muffler side you're certainly not going to. The tire is going to rub it, so you've got to have the 2-inch spacer. Okay, we've got our trike supported by our jack stands, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what I like to use, and it is, I'm not going to show you the label, but it's Lucas oil treatment. It's heavy duty oil stabilizer. I've used this in the forks of this three-wheeler, and I also use it in the differential. The reason why I don't like using the Honda branded stuff is because it gets all foamy. And as we know, anything with bubbles or foam in it is not creating a consistent film on our gears that have to mesh together. This stuff is really thick and goopy, it's like honey. And I like to spin the tires on it so that the gears will pull the oil up into the differential. You only swallow a little bit at a time. You know, if you want to be creative, what I've done before is I will actually put it on some jack stands. By the way, the only reason why I'm doing this is because when I took it off, I tilted it on its side, and a lot of the fluid leaked out. So I thought, well, it's a good time to go ahead and replace it. This stuff has done me well for more than just this bike, so I recommend it for sure. And it's so thick, you know, that without a doubt that if water gets in there or anything like that, it's going to have a tough time getting through this. Okay, as you can see, now that we've got our wheels back on and our rear differential is lubed, helper, if you will, let's take a look at the side of this bike here, and let's see if we can see a lot of difference in the clearance of the wheels and the fenders. Let's look at the other side. Looks pretty even. You know, I stared at that old swing arm to try and figure out what I was looking at. I tried to figure out where it was bent or where it was broken, and I could see where there was a weld that was slightly cracked, but I certainly didn't see the amount of play that that had added up to. Let's look at the back side of it. Now you can barely tell that there's anything wrong with it. At some point in its life, somebody rolled it over, and from our perspective, it's the left rack. That top area is slightly bent down, but it's ever so slight. Now we've got this nice new fresh, completely rebuilt for all intents and purposes rear end with the swing arm, the bearings, the whole deal, and we're no longer bent up. I think it looks pretty good.
We hope you liked our video. Please subscribe. We will be posting more videos, not just on this three-wheeler, but on other types of machines.
Thank you, helper. You did a great job. We hope everybody enjoyed it. Please leave us some comments. Give us your feedback.